All we're left with at this point are the consequences. Hello everyone, this is Chris Martenson here with your SARS-CoV-2, aka the honey badger virus update for March 18th, 2020. I've titled this one, Consequences. This is going to be a short intro deck that I'm going to go through here, and then I've got a very special interview that I conducted, so you get to see my smiling face, as it were. And I hope you stick around for that and check that out, because it's a really great interview with Peter Boghossian. He's the author of How to Have Impossible Conversations, which many of us are starting to have those or have tried to have those of late. Really important topic. So let's go through the numbers here real quick, see what we got. Wow, Italy, 4,000 new cases, and they now have far more active cases than any other country in the world. And they have, as well, more cases per 1 million in population. And remember, you don't get herd immunity until how many people out of a million? 800,000 have caught this thing. So they still have a long way to go, obviously, as do we all, before we get to anything that would look like herd immunity. Iran, way too low on these numbers. I'm sure they have to go a lot higher, and we'll look at those more, I guess, in the future. Hopefully we'll get some better data out. Spain coming on really strong here. Remember a while ago I said that we would move into all triple digits. Yep, here we are. We're moving now. This whole column is going to be quadruple digits soon, this whole thing. And then someday we're going to see our first 5-digit number up here as well, because that is the nature of an exponential disease like this. As well, we're seeing the death count really begin to rack up here for a lot of countries. The United States mounting a big, strong 1,600 increase. A lot of these coming out of New York State, and a lot of these coming out of places where testing has actually happened. So look here again at the total cases per million population. United States is not that much better than everybody else. UK, no way. This is a testing shortfall more than anything. Very suspicious about this number as well. All right, so what can I tell you? This thing's exploding. Also, when we look at tests by population, so this is tests per million people. Thank you, Leos Art here, for bringing this to my attention. Also found on the Worldometer's site. I just didn't know where to look for it. So here you see how many tests have been conducted per million people. Bahrain, world's leader. I got a really nice email from somebody in Bahrain explaining just how wonderfully that government has been doing as well at really containing this thing. And it all starts with testing. If you care about the people in your country, you test, you test, you test. South Korea in the number 2 spot. No question why these countries, these top 3 right here, have done such a good job of containing the disease, because they tested a lot. And then there's this big, huge drop-off. Boom. You have to come, 50% less than Hong Kong so far. Another 50% nearly drop-off. And if you want to know how much your country cares about its people, you have to find them on this list somewhere. Oh, mine's missing. So, but look at this. Look at the difference between 35 tests per million and 4,900 tests per million of population. All right. Looking at an updated chart here, I just drew 3 separate lines in here because it feels like, obviously there could have been a 4th line right there, but this was a line for a period of time. This one seems to be a little bit progressing at a faster pace. This one at a slightly slower pace, but still all of them are linear. Yes, this is still exponential growth in case count. Remember from yesterday, this is our future that we're facing together. How much are we going to see these curves compressed and shifted? And of course, the leaders of various countries are dealing with the idea that even if they really suppress things here in spring, it'll probably just come roaring back in fall. So there is this let it happen movement, which I think we're going to explore that more in some future ones, because I think if this is the reality, then there are ways, I think, that we could go about more sanely getting towards herd immunity than just sort of letting it rip through our population willy-nilly. I think there's a case to be made for segregating people. Put the old over here, let the young and the healthy get it, if that's the story we want to make. But first, I need to see more data to find out if even that's humane, because with the fibrotic damage that happens to these lungs of the people who have recovered, is there really a recovery around this? We still have people that have been not recovered for weeks and weeks and weeks on this thing. So maybe it's not even sane to say, let's let the young catch it and they'll be fine. And hopefully we'll build up herd immunity that way. But no good decisions to be made. Remember, this is not the flus. It's just not SARS. And right now, at the time of this recording, I started this just before 4 o'clock Eastern here on March 18th. Absolute market mayhem again. This bounced a lot just in the last, it was really ugly before somebody came in and started buying right before the close. I think I know who that was. But at any rate, still 5-6% down across the major indices. The Russell 2000, these small caps, no bounce for them, down nearly 12% at the time of this recording. But this is the stunner, 17.5% down again for crude oil. A big, massive, massive loss. $22. Are you crazy? This is going to destroy all kinds of national budgets, sovereign budgets, major oil company budgets, shale companies. This is an absolutely capital-destroying event that's happening here in crude oil. And of course, crude oil is the thing that tells you the most about future economic activity. Interesting to see gold continue to get shellacked. I think this is just like 2008, but look, not as shellacked as equities. Where this is being sold in the paper markets by people who own paper contracts, who need to raise dollars. I get that. This next period of time is going to be all about the dollar. But before we talk about that real quick, look at this staggering, absolutely monster move in the U.S. 10-year bond. That is just absolutely gigantic. And no, it didn't reverse in the close here with this little faux bounce that's happening over here right now. VIX at an 80? Are you crazy? Keep a journal, people. This is absolutely mind-blowing stuff here right now. The big story, of course, is the dollar. So when you see euro, this is the euro against the USD. When it's on top like this, if you see red, that means the bottom number is getting stronger. This is a flip. So the USD is on top. It's getting stronger because this is green. But look at this crush of the British pound. Crush for a currency? Are you crazy? A 4% move? That's insane. So these are insane moves in the markets right now. Here are my quick conclusions for today before we move on to the live part of this where, live, it's recorded, but I interview Peter Boghossian, and we'll get to that in just a second. Conclusions here now. We are now in triple-digit increase stage, heading rapidly towards seeing just quadruple-digit increases across that whole worldometer number one page that I go for the numbers. The best countries, they test the most. Right? The best countries in this story, the ones that care the most about their people's lives, test the most. And that's just a simple statement, a fact for me. Life is now changed forever. You know, what was is just not coming back. That's what the financial markets are telegraphing finally, but I think you and I, we knew this a long time ago. What happened is life-changing, and we're not going back to what we had. We have a whole new future in front of us, and we're going to have to figure out how to manage that. Which means really you're on your own, depending on which government and which country you've got serving you. You know, it didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way. There were other ways to conduct this. But because here we are now, and because life has now changed forever, and what was is not coming back, we need to know how to manage the conversations we're going to have with each other, how to manage our emotions, how to manage the very delicate part of piecing our lives back together, because 85% of how your future is going to unfold is going to be determined by your emotional state, your emotional intelligence, your emotional health, and the relationships that you have. So let's go on to this part 2 of this, where we talk with Peter Boghossian. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. Chris Martenson of Peak Prosperity here. And as you know, we've been tracking the coronavirus for quite some time. And today, we're going to do something a little bit different. First, it's not the disembodied voice talking to a PowerPoint, which you've gotten used to. Today, we're going live in video recording here, and we have a special guest today. I'm not going to update the numbers. I think we all know where we are in this story. I've been tracking this diligently for well over 50 days now, and now it's become self-evident. We've moved through that third stage of truth for Schopenhauer, right? At first, people are in denial about it. They're actively resisting it. Second, they're ridiculing you. They're fighting you around it. And third, it's become self-evident. So now we've gotten to that self-evident stage, but not entirely. And so that's what we want to talk about today, because I believe going forward, the number one thing we're going to have to manage through this is our relationships with each other, the emotions that come up around this. This is a really troubling time for all of us. And I'm struggling with this as much as anybody, even though I'm a fast adjuster. I've been through my adjustment process. I'm sure I'm in better shape than some, but how do you get your head around the idea that our entire way of life just changed? So there was yesterday and there's tomorrow, and they're not going to look anything like each other for a long time. And without trying to solve for what tomorrow looks like, we got to get through today. And many of you now find yourself in all new situations. Maybe you have new people in your household, or you're feeling isolated because you're used to a flow of activity and suddenly you're in self-isolation like I am. And maybe it's awkward because we have to talk 8 feet apart from each other now, and we're not shaking hands. We're doing all sorts of new things all at once. And that is an emotional process more than a technical process. So today we're going to be talking with Dr. Peter Boghossian. He is assistant professor of philosophy at Portland State University. We've had him on the program before. He's the author of the incredible book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And he's got just a big, long pedigree, 30 years of teaching, thousands of students under his belt, and he's just a wonderful communicator. So who better to have on this program today to talk about how to have these impossible conversations, some of them inside our own houses, some of them with people we've known for our whole lives, or people we are married to and we should know really well, but all of a sudden, totally new landscape here. And believe me, this is going to be the hardest part about all of these adjustments, is managing what's happening here. And so with that, Peter, thank you so much for making time today, and it's great to have you back.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you being on and your kind words. We find ourselves in a rather extraordinary situation right now.
Well, we do. So let's start personal. What can you share about your own situation? What's changed for you?
Well, I'll be extremely blunt with you. I don't sleep in the same bed with my wife anymore. My wife is a healthcare provider. I had an office. My son was in college. College for him is no more. So he's living in the home with us. I think he's about to go crazy, and he hasn't even been here for 4 or 5 days. We have a bunch of people. This is why I'm not in my office anymore. We have additional people. You mentioned about people living in the home. So they're closed quarters. For the first time in my whole, I'm just being incredibly honest and blunt with you right now. For the first time in my whole life, I'm not a gun guy. I went to the gun store. In fact, I was driving to the gun store with my daughter, and we had never been to a gun store before. And everything looked like a ghost town here in Portland, Oregon. And this one store had a lot of cars. And I joked to my daughter, I said, boy, wouldn't that be funny if that were the gun store? Things would be worse than I thought they were. Sure enough, it was the gun store. So quick story. So we walk into the gun store. The place is packed, which is very bad, for social distancing. The place really was packed. And they had sold out of many guns. And then I realized at that point, this was very serious. So things have changed in my personal life, my home. I went from being insanely busy all the time, never having a second, to basically sitting in my house all day. I can't go to the gym. I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I can't do that. So I'm sitting in my basement now. We've made a little home gym. We use bottles of bleach and Clorox, and we lift those. So it's in my retirement is in the market. That's all gone. So my way of life has radically changed in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah. And from my end, my fiance Evie and I, we just moved into a new home. I found myself with an incredible, I'm sure there's a right word, and I don't want to botch this, but it was a responsibility and obligation. So I found myself in this storytelling role. I'm a translator. I'm able to take complex information and translate it in a way people can hear. So I started picking that up. I don't know how to put that baton down. I'm working as hard as I've ever worked in my life because, each day I'm putting out about 40 minutes of video material, which is probably about 8 hours of research. And it's a couple hours of recording. And then I hand it off to somebody who compresses it and uploads it and puts it up onto YouTube. But do you know what it's like to come up with a new brand? It's like I'm giving a new speech every single day. I'm developing a curriculum on the fly, and I'm doing it on a daily basis. And so I have that going on. Plus, we just moved to a new house. And so full honesty, there have been times where we found ourselves short with each other, and it's about nothing. It's not about how clean the kitchen isn't. It's really about the fact that I have unprocessed, I'm carrying so much and I don't know how to put it down, also, I don't know how to process this because everything in our lives has just changed, and I'm peering forward and I'm saying, well, when does this get back to normal? And the answer is, I don't think it does.
I agree.
That's a really big concept to get my mind around. And I don't know what that means for my kids. I don't know what it means for my mom, who I probably can't see for, I don't know how long now, because she's 80, mid 80s and all of that. So it's a lot to process.
Yeah, so we're all trying to figure this out. And very quickly before we go on, I do want to say in all seriousness, you have done an extraordinary job of taking very complex things and making it accessible to people. And I know that I've learned a tremendous amount, and people have commented to me and thanked me for turning them on to your stuff. So it's fantastic. But I also realized in that same breath that that's a burden for you, right? So that's something that you're attempting to do to navigate a new landscape to help people. And that's not easy either. Okay, so let's take two steps back, and I will make it personal if for a moment. So here's the situation in which I find myself, and I'm sure many people find themselves, maybe even most people at this point. We are self-isolating. We're in our home. We have kids. Our kids' schools have been postponed. Quarters are tight. Even I have a very large house. Quarters are still very tight. So what do we do? Well, let me throw some ideas out for your listeners and tell you what I have done that's worked pretty well for us. Our first order of business, and all in the back of my mind here, I'm trying to push this whole enterprise forward. So we adopted our dog. So in the adopting of a dog, I looked at it like a homeschool project. It was a combination of doing something. I'm a dog person, doing something good, taking a dog out of a pound, particularly. This wasn't a kill shelter. This was a humane society. Excuse me. But we didn't just adopt a dog. We gave it to my daughter as a homeschool project. So she had to watch videos. I have an old dog training book that we made her read. Like, she had ownership of this project. Because when you're homeschooling, it's one thing, because many people who homeschool get out of the homes and they leave at some point and their kid, but that's over. So I think my own opinion is that those kind of tight relationships need a little bit of space. So the dog thing was perfect. So that's one idea that folks can do. However, we just received something from Portland Public Schools saying it's April 19th, schools are going to open. I would be astonished if schools opened April 19th. So a dog is going to take you for about a month. But there are online resources for your kids. My wife and I have instituted reading programs where we all read, including my son, who's just mentioned, home from college. So we have books and book chapters we read, and then we talk about those books for a book club. And then we have the room that we've turned into a workout room, and my daughter has laminated some. The whole idea behind everything I'm saying now is that we have communal projects in which we're engaged. And I've tried to take some of that off of us so they can get their alone time, so they can, get the time with the dog or what have you. If you're not a dog person, you could do it with a cat, but it's not quite, it doesn't quite require the same degree of resources to education for the children. So those are just some quick things you can do. There's nothing to do with conversation, but the idea is that you want to make space for everybody at some points through reading, through maybe the Khan Academy, online resources for your kids, so that you're not in each other, talking to each other constantly.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to take a big step back, because I thought that your book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, was just pitched perfectly for the moment in history we found ourselves. There was the left and the right, and they're at each other's throats and unable to talk about things. There's the PC movement going on campuses. It felt like there was this fractured ability to be connected and to find that sense of unity around all sorts of ideas. And now we go from that slamming straight into this micro world where all of a sudden now we're just sort of thrown into like these little, just like those reality shows like Big Brother, you're just like, clunk, we're stuck in a house.
Right.
So how do we bridge that gap? Let's start here. Let's talk about what are impossible conversations, and what are the general, let's start there, because a lot of people listening to this don't have the benefit of having listened to our earlier conversation. I'll direct them there as well. But let's rewind, have the basic conversation. What is an impossible conversation, and how do we have them?
Okay, so an impossible conversation is either a conversation across a gulf, a divide, a political divide, a moral divide, or an epistemological guide. So the epistemology is a $2 word for how you know what you think you know. So if there's some kind of a gulf, often when people get divorced, the reason is incommensurable differences. And incommensurable differences is never the tide shall meet. Like somebody speaks Mandarin and someone else speaks Swahili and they don't speak each other's language. That's an incommensurable language gulf. So an impossible conversation is a conversation in which someone's not willing to budge, someone doesn't want to listen, somebody two people just have radically different commitments, ideological commitments, two different radically different worldviews. And it's also a situation in which you're just tired, or you're with a relative, you're exasperated, you don't know where to go, you don't know what to say next. So the book is meant to help people kind of as a self-help tool in a sense. You could, it's conceivable you could go through your whole life and never seek anybody out for these conversations, but it's inconceivable that anybody would ever come to you. Right. So in this sense, in this context, we're sitting here with our family members and we know exactly what they think. The smallest thing irritates us. So how do we navigate those issues? And it's, as you know, it's a huge question.
Yeah, absolutely. So when there's this big gulf and the way I'll tell you from my perspective. So when I get into my little rut and something's happening and I'm annoyed at somebody, I have the emotions up, right? It's not logical anymore. What happens is I'm pretty sure I'm right. I have this little story going.
Exactly.
I'm right. I've got this point of view and it's correct. And then it sort of comes out at the other person. And so what you're describing here, in many cases, that gulf, that gap is coming because we have a different point of view around something, meaning we have a different belief system maybe, but I find it's not actually based on the data, right? It's not, I have a database, I got my little inner prosecutor, my judge, it's got a lot of data around why I'm right, but that's actually not the issue, is it?
Right. No, it's not the issue. And what you just described, we call the message delivery service. So here's how you know if you're in a message delivery service, and then I'll tell you how to avoid that. If you think to yourself, oh, if they only knew this, or, oh, if they only had this one piece of data, or if they only had this one little piece of information, they'd change their minds. Well, that's not how we work. In fact, giving people that one little piece of data often causes the backfire effect, and then they go further down and they hunker back in their beliefs. A few days ago, I was, this is right after the gun store, I came out and somebody wanted to shake my hand. And this is a key principle that operates in a lot of these impossible conversations. She put her hand out to me. She recognized me. She put her hand out to me and she said, oh, Dr. Bogosian. And I said, I put my hand up immediately because it was instinctual, because she came out at me at no end. She said, oh, you think I'm infected? And I said, which I shouldn't have done that in the first place. I should have immediately said to her, oh, I don't know if I'm infected and I don't want to infect you. So I should have put it on myself as opposed to that initial response that I made a mistake. I turned around and she just was right there. But the idea there is that you want to place those on yourself as opposed to someone else. And you never want to deliver a message to somebody. So you never want to say, oh, if they only had, okay. So there are two things operative there. One is with strangers, and she was a stranger, and the other one is in your house. In the house, it's even more important in your household to not deliver a message to your family members. They already know everything you think. They already know everything you believe. And it's just going to, it's not only going to cause them to want to do something else, it's going to damage your relationship with them. And that especially if we're stuck in quarantine, that is something you don't want to do.
So let's deliver a message. What are some examples here when we would deliver a message?
Well, if you're talking about anything controversial across a political and moral divide, if you give a data point, if you give a fact, if you give a piece of evidence. So when you figure out how someone, and this truly is, Chris, this is the most difficult thing. I've literally been around the world for my first book talking about this. And this is the one thing that I've come to the conclusion that for whatever reason, people won't do it. And I think I know why. Most people think, well, I formulate my beliefs on the basis of evidence. Therefore, they formulate their beliefs on the basis of evidence. So if I just gave them this evidence, they would change their beliefs. That is not true. That is false. Most people do not formulate their beliefs on the basis of evidence. I'll give you a quick example. You asked about an example of a message service. Anytime you're offering it evidence, you're delivering a message. So most people, they want their views confirmed. They want you to believe what they believe. They don't really want to their goal in the conversation isn't to revise their beliefs. I'll give you a quick example. It's a wonderful little video from a guy by the name of Anthony Magnabosco. He does street epistemology from my first book, and he'll basically go around and he's had tens of thousands of hours of conversations. There are people all around the world who do this. They get GoPros and they they upload those to YouTube. So a woman comes and he interviews a woman. She believes in karma, and oh no, she believes in the soul. And he says to her, "Okay, so what evidence do you have in the existence of the soul?" And she says, "Well, there was a famous experiment in Germany where they put souls on they weighed them out, and when they put people who were on their deathbed, they weighed them, and when the soul left the body upon their death, they lost 7 pounds, and we know this is a soul." Now, the vast majority of people who heard that will start delivering messages, or they'll start challenging. Well, what was the name of the study? Where in Germany was it? Was it replicated? How do you know it was legitimate? How do you know it wasn't a hoax? That's what the vast majority of people do. Or they'll deliver their own message. There's no soul, that's BS, etc. But here's what he said, and this, when you figure this out, this principle is just gold. He said to her, "What about an 8-pound baby? If an 8-pound baby died, would it lose 7 pounds?" And he waited in the pregnant pause. So you don't want to fill those spaces. But the idea there is he didn't bring in any evidence. He didn't attack her belief. And he said that, and he just waited. And in the videos, when she kept saying, interesting. So you're not telling her anything. You're not delivering her a message. You're not saying there's not a soul. You're not challenging her. You're not questioning her. You're asking her if she believes herself. So that's an example of how to do that.
Interesting. Yeah, I get that. So, fortunately, my fiance, she's very emotionally mature. So we have fairly high emotional IQ. We still have our rough spots. And one of the things that she's taught me is that whenever one of these two words comes out, we know we're talking with a triggered part, a piece of ourselves that's probably fairly young and demanding attention. And those two words are always and never.
Right.
You always, you never. And as soon as those come out, it's just like a little like ding. Oh, we're in that moment. We are no longer speaking with rational adult Chris in this point in time. We're now talking with some other part that needs to be heard or doesn't feel like it's heard or something like that. So one of the things I picked up from your book is this idea of, like in that example where that person was delivering a question back, which is more of an invitation than a statement, is this idea of wanting to cross over that divide a little bit and be curious about where the other person is. So how would that come to play in this circumstance we're in?
Well, here's what happens even before we get to that point is that people will become defensive. So you always, you never, or you anything. Anytime you're already you're invoking a defensive posture. So those words in that language is key. And what you don't want to do is invoke a defensive posture because, again, like your fiance is correct, you're not having a conversation anymore. You'll find that most people, particularly your intimates, will like you and respect you more, not only if you listen, but if you own it, if you take responsibility for it. And I think that was one of the reasons of Jordan Peterson's popularity, because he kept talking about one of his mantras, well, how we have to own things and how we have to take more responsibility on ourselves. In fact, I said that to my son the other night, who was super bummed about being home. His whole life, he had an internship with a congressman here. His whole life has just been disrupted. I said, I'm sorry, and not a but, and this is when you have to step up. This is when you have to own it. This is when you have to make more of a contribution and not less of a contribution. So that goes to one, reframing. That goes to two, when you're in a conversation, particularly in a house with your intimate, people will respect you more if you're less defensive as opposed to you being more defensive. So if they say, oh, hey, you're not, everybody in a house, I've learned from my household, everybody thinks they're doing a disproportionate share of the responsibilities. You're always emptying the dishwasher. You're always doing this. So the idea there is the same thing as Peterson's shtick. It's to just take more responsibility on yourself, particularly if you really are stuck in a situation like this. You don't want to be the person everyone's thinking they don't do enough. So how do you do that? How do you have those conversations with somebody without being defensive? The book, we talk about modeling, pro-social modeling. You have to always be the one who steps up. You have to be the one who takes more of the dishes, who washes the floor, who, makes sure that the dog is, if you have dogs, we comb the dogs every day, particularly one of our dogs is a major shedder. So you have to take the responsibility and do those things. And then from that, when you speak, you've spoken from the example of somebody who's really working hard.
Mm-hmm. So
does that make sense?
It does. That does make sense. So I want to see if we can make this really concrete, because you mentioned something at the outset I want to loop back to, which is you're not sleeping in the same bed as your wife. And so that sounds to me like a very difficult conversation to have. And I bet you a lot of people are having that same conversation. I know a friend of mine has had to have that because his wife is a pilot. And so,
right, exactly.
So if one of you is sort of in self-isolation, but the other partner has to be out in contact, whether they work in retail or, whatever that is, you have a lot of contact, particularly you mentioned healthcare worker. How did you have that conversation?
Well, that's good. Well, not only we're not sleeping in the same bed, we used to use the same towels. Just to save water, we would put a glass by the sink and we would use the same glass. We don't do that anymore. We don't shush out. We have, well, that was actually a very, very easy conversation and wasn't impossible at all. I said to her, and that's the other thing in this, it's always phrased in terms of a question because you don't want to deliver a message, you want to ask. So that taps into internal motivation for change, in motivational interviewing. If people think that they had the idea themselves, it's much easier to convince them. Many salespeople know this as well. Excuse me. So I said to her, so you are going to the hospital almost every day. Do you think it's a good idea that we maintain close contact with each other anymore? And actually, the background for this is I have Crohn's disease. So it's an autoimmune disorder. I am on immunosuppressants. So that's not helping things very much either. Mm-hmm. So when I asked her the question, I didn't tell her, I didn't say, hey, I love you, but I don't think we should sleep in the same bed. I don't think that would have gone over too well. But I asked her, do you think we should sleep in the same bed? Do you think it's safe? Do you think that increases the chances of one of us being ill? And she thought about it and she said, you know what? Good point. Now, maybe you don't have that type of relationship with your spouse, then that's a really, truly impossible conversation. But the key there is that you had to ask a question for that as opposed to telling somebody something.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So not delivering a message, putting it in a form of a question. A lot of people who are listening to this right now have found themselves in this sort of a spot. A lot of people. Yep.
I thought I lost you there. We're lagging. Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, we can just edit that part out. So you seem to be back too. So Peter, a lot of people listening to this right now are what we would call early adjusters. And so they've been kind of at the front of this and you know how it's a bell curve of reactions. There are still people out there saying, dude, it's the flu, bro. And not really buying it, or maybe thinking this is a big sort of a thing to maybe take Trump down, or whatever their belief system is not there yet. How do you approach a gulf where say you're convinced, got a shadow of a doubt, this is a real deal, this is a pandemic, but you have to interact with in some meaningful way with somebody who's really not there yet? How do you start that conversation?
That's a great question. Here's exactly what I would say. And from the book, so every word you use is incredibly important here. You can't, this is not just capricious. I can give you the thrust of it, but the words are key. Here's what I would say. Well, I really hope you're correct. I sincerely, who wouldn't want, who's hoping for a pandemic unless you're a freaking lunatic? And even freaking lunatics aren't hoping for a pandemic because, they're still in quarantine. So I really hope you're correct. So Chris, I'm sure you're familiar with the precautionary principle, right?
Yep.
So if you're talking to somebody who's more educated, you can say to them, it does seem to me, and I'm curious as to your thoughts, do you think it's good to invoke a precautionary principle here? So if you're talking to someone more educated, that's good. So you start with validating, man, I hope it's a hoax. Someone says, I hope you're right. I really hope that this is a hoax. Or I really hope that more people, I don't want anyone to die from the flu, but of course, I really hope that exponentially more people die from the flu than are going to die from this. But don't you think, or isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Now, that line of asking someone that will only take you so far. You could be dealing with that I think it was the preacher in Kentucky who believes this is a hoax, and he has their his parishioners lick the floor, right?
Mhm.
So then that's chapter 7 of the book, dealing with complete ideologues. Then you need a different tool set. But most people, if you say, hey, well, you could be right, maybe you are, I really don't know, I'm not an epidemiologist, I have no idea, I certainly hope you're right. Don't you think it's good, though, to invoke a precautionary principle in this? Don't you think it's good to take precautions and hope for the best, and then if you're wrong, it doesn't make any difference?
Mhm.
And then, so again, you framed it in terms of a question, you validated what they thought, you didn't invoke a defensive posture. Most people who are most sane people would say, yeah, it's probably good to take precautions, and if this ends up being nothing, that's great. The other thing you could do is you could say this: look, I don't know anything about this, let's just say you're right. Even if that's the case, the fact that most people are panicking about this, doesn't that create a problem? And then you wait, right? So either way, through those questions, you've elicited the response: either yes, we should be precautionary, or you know what, this probably is BS, but so many people believe it that we need to start acting accordingly,
Yeah.
all without delivering a message.
Right. So I like that. So the idea is, what's the question that you can ask, the equivalent of the 8-pound baby question? So if you've got somebody and you really need to interact with them, and by the way, if you don't need to interact with somebody and they're not there, my advice is walk away.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
just don't have the conversation. But if it's really somebody you need to interact with, um, then the question is around what can you say or what can you ask that's going to get them to open up and start thinking about this. Like, one of the
Yes.
questions that I've used is this one. I said, I'd like to think that it's really nothing, but the way the Chinese government reacted told me
Excellent.
that this was really actually serious, because I'm not sure the Chinese government really cares about human life the same way we do.
Right.
And because they reacted that way, it seems like they knew something that maybe we didn't. Does that seem important to you?
Yeah, that's great. That's a fantastic question for people who are in that mindset. Again, talking about my son was telling me, he has an internship for the congressman, and people would call him and tell him it's a hoax by Obama, who was out of office 4 years ago. It's a hoax to destabilize Trump, and he'd get all these, calls, from totally deranged calls from folks about hoaxes or Chinese governments, or whatever. But so that will work with a certain set of people. Most of the time, I love these things called disconfirmation questions. In the philosophy literature, it's called a defeasibility. So a disconfirmation question, and they always have to be set up right, is under what conditions would you be willing to change your mind? So you affirm them right away, so you don't invoke a defensive posture. Boy, I hope that's right. You certainly could be right. Then you state your own ignorance, so you place somebody else in. You could do two things at this point. One is, we talk about in the book, the unread library effect. This is great. The second is scales, asking someone to put their belief on a scale from 1 to 10. How concerned do you think a rational person should be? And the third is disconfirmation. What evidence could I present you with what evidence could you find that would cause you to change your mind? So let's go through those in reverse order, if we may. So what evidence would you have to see to present so that you would say, wow, this is some very serious business and we have to act accordingly? Like, what would that evidence look like? And then they'll give you their evidence. The other thing you can do is, I mentioned, a scale. You can ask someone to put their belief on a scale. On a scale from 1 to 10, how concerned are you about this? Now, let's say that they say to you, well, I'm 6 concerned. It could be something, but it's almost definitely not. So then you say, that's interesting. What if somebody is a 3? Talk me to how we get to a 6. Like, what would you say to move them up to where you are on the scale? Now, that's counterintuitive, because most people would say, well, why aren't you a 9? And then what they would do is they would hear reasons, and they would talk themselves into going lower on the scale. But by telling them a lower number and then asking them to move up, not only do you get a free guided tour, by the way, of their epistemology, but they're actually talking themselves into questions. They're talking themselves into raising their confidence on the scale. And okay, so before we go through, how are those things so far? There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, that's good. So the the idea of really understanding why somebody thinks they know what they know. I like that idea right there. And in particular, if I love the idea of having somebody, if they're wherever they are on the scale, pick a lower number and have them try and walk themselves up to that. So take somebody who's really not uh, anywhere on the scale. So that's good, because that tells you, I like that free guided tour, because they're telling you where they're sitting and why they're sitting there, right? And so
That's correct.
you might get some information like, well, I would really need to see our local hospitals get overwhelmed, you know?
Okay, well, that's about 72 hours. Okay, but I wouldn't say that to them. I wouldn't say that to them. But I would have to hold back a laugh at that. Okay, so the other thing is that you want to expose the unread effect, and you do that by always place the stuff on yourself, whether it's I'm the handshake. I'm sorry, I don't want to get you sick. It's always placed on yourself. So someone says something that's really interesting. I really don't know anything about it, unless you do know something about it and you are actually an epidemiologist. Then don't lie to someone. But if you're not an epidemiologist, or you're not very familiar with pathogens, etc., you say to someone, well, it's interesting. I'm not a virologist. I'm curious. Tell me about, and then you ask them to describe in the most explicit detail that they can, whatever it is that's in question. So very quick story. So originally, some researchers did this with the inner workings of toilets, and they asked subjects in their test, how confident are you know how a toilet works, and people would be, rate their confidence as very high, and they would say to them, okay, so let's explain in as much detail the inner workings of a toilet. And then they would just be silent, and they wrote it down, and then they came back, and when they revisited that, they realized that they knew nothing about the inner workings of toilets, I actually asked someone that at a party once who was a plumber, and he gave me this insane thing. Okay, so again, you could be, if that's the case, if you're actually meeting a virologist or someone who knows about this, well, great, then you just got a free lesson, right? So they know something you don't know, so then you can know what they know. But the vast majority of people are not plumbers, they're not virologists, they're none of these things. But they do almost everybody overestimates or they inflate their own confidence in things. They have a stronger confidence in their belief than they should based upon the warrant of the evidence. So you say, okay, in as much detail as possible, explain, and then you ask them to explain something, and then you ask them to explain again. You're not telling them anything. You're asking a question for them to explain. And we've seen subsequent tests, people will even moderate their political beliefs when they realize they don't know, like a wall. Like, give me as much detail. Who would build it? How much would it cost? But the coronavirus is even better because it's so esoteric.
Yeah. So
people can understand a wall, but they have trouble understanding a virus.
Right. So, the framing I put around this was this great article by Peter Sandman about the adjustment reaction. I'd written my own piece 12 years ago around, I called it the 6 stages of awareness, modeled on Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which is just what happens when your when your whole scaffolding of what you know about the world is getting shaken.
Right.
That's an emotional process. For whatever reason, nature has said, we're going to wire those beliefs in, and we're going to make it expensive to change them. And this is not to say people are defective or we should be rational or we're being irrational. This is called being human, right? We have belief systems, and those are wired in, as best I can tell, through our limbic system, not our cortex. And so there they are, and they're guarded. They got, oh my gosh, it's like a landmine, DMZ zone with like just, 30 years of like landmines laid in there. So knowing that this is an emotional process that we need to go through, I think what you're saying is it's important to give people avenues for themselves to negotiate their own minefield rather than you trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and here's the thing I really want your listeners in particular to take away from this. So you have been sounding the alarm that we have been, the debt ratio is too high. We have some very serious fundamental problems in the economy. We need to have an honest discussion about this. Good luck having that in the universities. But so that was already part of your problem right there, is that you're fighting an establishment who, my daughter, she's in 8th grade, her school didn't even want to talk to them about social distancing and washing their hands because they were afraid that it would upset kids and give them trauma. Okay, well, where are we now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is what happens when you're talking about things. And people are like, oh, Chris is an extremist. You know, the economies, the market's 29. I just looked before our conversation. It's like 20,000. So turns out, in many ways, excuse me, in many ways, and for many of the right reasons, you are absolutely correct. Okay, and many of your listeners were correct. So this is what I really want your listeners to get out of this. For those people, and your Adam, your partner, contacted me, and I was going to have when I was going to go to the conference, and I had a nice talk. The slide designer has to talk, but how do you talk to your spouse about this? But we are now in a totally new context. We are now in a context in which the things that you've been sounding alarm about are absolutely true. So here's the piece of advice I want to give to your listeners. The response now is not, I told you so. In the book, we call that's the opposite of building a golden bridge. Here's a golden bridge. You know what? This is very complicated. There's no way you could have known that, but we're in this together now. Mm-hmm. Right? So you don't want to say, aha, look, I was right all along. I can't believe you were so stupid. Okay. You're going to have to, if for no other reason, you're going to have to live in a house with this person for an untold number of months on end. You do not want to be doing that. In fact, you want to be doing just the opposite. This is a golden bridge. Yeah, that was so complicated. Very few people understood the complexities of the global market. You are, insert a lawyer, a doctor, a food service handler. I didn't even know all this stuff. So you want to build a golden bridge like that so that you want to let people cross over to the side of belief, being like, wow, Chris is really gracious, or wow, whatever the listeners, this person is really gracious. We're in this together. They didn't make me feel stupid. They didn't belittle me. I don't have a defensive posture. I really love my partner. And I think that is one of the main deliverables I want people to take from this. Not, oh, I was right. Look, now we're really in the shitter. But this is a very complicated. Nobody could have foreseen this coming. I did take steps to do this. Just as a parenthetical, my daughter and I have been watching Preppers, the show, way before this. And it's funny, the underlying theme in that show is these people are nuts, right? I mean, it's not explicit, but it's like this thematic element woven through, like, wow, these people are really extremists. I don't know if people are saying that stuff anymore. When you go to the gun store and there's no guns, what do? Those conversations for those people, the more extreme your belief was and the more extreme you acted on the fact that we could be looking at a I don't want to say civilizational collapse. I don't see that yet, but certainly not going back to our old way of life. The more important it is for you to build a golden bridge.
I like that. And a lot of people listening to this are going to have that opportunity because and believe me, I have this personal experience, and I've had lots of people who are very close to me have the same experience, which is they were warning.
Right.
And if you are now waiting, requiring, expecting for that person who was resistant before to come forward and say, I was wrong, you were right.
Right.
Not going to happen, particularly if they think you're fishing for it, right? However subtly you're trying to reel in that, come on, give me.
And who cares if you're right? Exactly. The only thing that matters is how you move forward and your relationships with people now. So the fact that you're right is totally irrelevant. I mean, it's relevant to the fact that you improved your circumstances as opposed to what there could be, but it's utterly irrelevant going forward in terms of your relationships. The most important thing, Aristotle writes about this is replete in the history of Western intellectual thought, are your relationships in your community. And yes. You do not want to set yourself up as the person who's a dick. You do not want to be that guy, I told you so. I mean, do you like it when people tell you I told you so? No, you think they're a jerk, so you damage their relationship. So you want to be gracious and say, this was very complicated. I just love you so much. We're in this together. Let's get through this. And it's not even about you being right. It's totally irrelevant. You're living in a house with someone. Be gracious and be a good partner. So that's really a key deliverable. It's not about who's right. And help us all if the market falls another 5,000 points. The worse things get, the more important it is to be gracious about it and avoid the I told you so. The more important it is to build a golden bridge and not invoke a defensive posture.
Yeah, great. I really great advice. And so I actually think this is a key moment where I'm going to harken back to what you talked to your son about, that this is a moment where we're all going to be asked to really step up. Like this is, in gender terms, for me, this is time to man up, we would say, or this is
Right.
time to bring our full best selves, our
Yep.
divine feminine, our divine masculine, whatever language you want. This is really going to call on us. And once we get past our own little, swirl of, oh my God, what happened to my 401k? Do I have enough rice in the house? Once that sort of dust settles, this is unlike a hurricane. And, I had this experience living in North Carolina, and it was really amazing for me. 1989, I'm going to, I'm in graduate school. I'm getting my PhD at Duke, and Hurricane Hugo came by. And we were 3 hours from the coast, but he was a bad boy. And he was helped by the idea that there was about a week of rain beforehand, like 4 or 5
Right.
inches. So the ground is all loose. And even though he was really far inland and was really degraded, just played pickup sticks, took out every tree, and took out all the power lines. And, I had to chainsaw my way out my driveway. And what we had was this incredible experience where there's no TV service. Everybody's freezers are melting. There's barbecues happening. But we all knew that in a couple weeks,
Exactly.
it was going to undo itself and the power would come back on. And it did. The blue glow came back out of people's living rooms and everybody wandered back inside. But Peter, if I went back there today, however many years that is now, people would still say, hey, you remember that Hugo time? Because it was that moment of community binding. So
Right.
Two things. One, I find that these sorts of things can bring out the best in people. But my concern is that Hugo, we knew that was going to be a 2-week interruption. This looks like, if you peer forward, this could be a far more permanent sort of a disruption in terms of my lifetime. How do you think that's going to start to influence how people react here?
Not well. I mean, we've already seen the system itself was inherently fragile, right? And we've seen how people respond, and it really brings out, in many senses, the worst in people. So I don't know none of us know what's going to happen, but it becomes more clear by the day that things are not going to, I don't know if there'll ever be a return to normal. I not to do it non sequitur, but I watched a television show. I love sci-fi, called Counterpart. And in this alternative dimension, these folks were decimated by, well, decimated means 10%, but they were wiped out by this virus. And their protocols for engaging with people and dealing with people, I don't think we're ever going to go back to shaking hands. I could be wrong about that. I don't see that happening. I think social distancing, I think that's going to manifest itself on Tinder and the sexual arena. I think this is just going to change forever our way of life. Now, I think that's going to be forever. Whether those changes are large or small, I don't know. The question, my expertise is, how do you deal with that in your relationships with people? And if you're in the situation I am, where your son or daughter has come home and they had their whole life trajectory planned out, I think yes, you want to acknowledge that this is difficult, and yes, it sucks, and yes, you're sorry, but also, this is what I expect. This is what I expect. You need to man up. You need to take more responsibility for yourself and for your family. So the line to them is not, oh, boo-hoo you. The line is, we're in this together. Let's do this. And here are my expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you will also find, not only will it be good for them, it will be good for your relationship.
Yeah.
And then, say, look, you got this. I believe in you. I love you. I believe in you. We're in this together. Here's what I expect. You need to start taking on more responsibility.
Yeah, and my advice, that's great. I love that, and I love what you said earlier too, which is this is a great time to learn a new language. Go on Khan Academy and better yourself. I think people should start gardens.
Right.
We're going to need fresh food and all of that other stuff, but this is really a time to as quickly as possible adjust to this new reality, because no matter what happens, there will always be an economy. There's an economy in Leavenworth, a supermax prison, right? People, there's always going to be an economy, but it's going to be very different. And so in this context, finding out who you are, what you're good at, so that you can add value to whatever situation you're in, is very different from saying, I have to train for a paycheck, because that world is going to be shrunk. That'll still exist to some extent, but it's going to be a fraction of what it was, unless, I really missed the mark here. So now
you haven't missed the mark.
That's a
You've
whole
not missed the mark.
problem. I don't think I have, but I might be wrong, but I'm not confused, is how I put it. So this is If I wanted to really help support somebody who's needing to really make that enormous mental readjustment, how would I offer myself in that circumstance?
Well, I would say I this is going to seem totally counterintuitive, but I would say let's go help the neighbors. You have an elderly neighbor, you can't get them food, let's get them food. Let's be actors, be doers. Don't passively sit back. Of course, that if there's a mass quarantine, you can't do that. So it depends on what the context is, but again, calling them to more responsibility and more doing as opposed to exactly the opposite, which is less doing. Or we have neighbors, they can't come out of their house, they can't mow their lawn. Okay, you I'll mow their lawn. I'll pro-social model it, as I said. You mow the other neighbor's lawn. And it's also, you're not going to the gym anyway, so this is great exercise. So the idea that should you reflect? Yeah, but you should do. And you should do things that help other people. And again, those acts are what bring meaning to one's life. And they make this whole situation, I'm in my basement now. I have so many people living in my house. They make this whole situation not only livable and manageable, but it really truly is an opportunity to bring out the best in people.
This is a question that's applies to a lot of people, but specifically Adam Taggart, my business partner here, because he's got some teens in the house. And the question is, my teens think they're invincible and want to go out with their friends, and my parents don't want to stop seeing their grandchildren. How do I help them, the teenagers, realize that they're putting us all in unnecessary jeopardy if they go out and somehow get exposed and bring this thing home?
Yeah, it's a tough question. You can tell them directly, but that's delivering a message. You can ask them, and this is a tricky part, but you can ask them, if you do have the virus and it stays in you for 5 days before we know, and you infect grandma or grandpa, I mean, it seems like a silly question, but how would you feel about that? Mm-hmm. So asking in terms of a question and framing it that way might help. With your kids, we're still not under quarantine, so we can still do some social as of this, whatever the date is today. Right now, we're not under quarantine. So I'm not sure if someone's in the neighborhood, if they want to stand 6 feet apart with each other with no hugging or contact, if they just want to walk around the block together. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I don't think that's a problem right now. But I would ask questions and say, well, geez, if you did infect grandma, or if you did bring the virus home and we got sick, how would you feel? Or how would you take care of yourself? How would you take care of us? What would you do? What would your plan be? That's kind of like the unread library effect too. What would your plan be if we can't move in our room? Mm-hmm. Like, how would you, so you're asking them questions to instill a sense of responsibility with them. And the other thing is, if you're a stricter parent, I would forgo most, if not all, rules about social media and screen time. I'd encourage FaceTime, because we do need communities. Kids do need their friends. This is an extraordinary time. It's not exactly ahistorical, but it's certainly ahistorical, and everybody who's alive now, their lifetimes. So I would chill out on the FaceTime and the social media restrictions, the internet restrictions.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is, I think, knowing teens, having raised 3 kids myself, that it's, the first week or two, this is sort of an interesting thing, but what do we do in month 1 or 2? Because all the data I have suggests that this thing's going to be with us probably through June, depending on how fast it burns. And then hopefully it goes away for summer, but it might come back again in fall. So we might be through a couple cycles of this before, whatever was normal before is not normal anymore. And so that's a tricky conversation to have, because we don't know what it means. They don't know what it means. Nobody really knows what it means. So,
right.
That I think
the answer to that is counterintuitive. The answer is, again, more responsibility. Asking people to take more responsibility. Asking your kids to read the books, and you read the books, especially if you're home. If you're working, it's a little different. But setting up things. Find a project, find something in the house. I mentioned getting a dog. I'm a big fan of taking dogs, particularly out of kill shelters. Adopt a puppy. Find a goal-centered, a goal-oriented thing where there's at least some of that is alone time, so you're not engaging with other people constantly. and ask your family to take on more responsibility. I think that's part of the solution. And then taking it, always bringing it back to yourself. You washing more dishes, you doing more things. So then when you ask someone to do something or you make a request, you do so from authority, lived authority.
Oh, that's great. I know we're gonna be continuing this conversation because we're just at the beginning of this. Really, thank you so much for your time today.
Hi, folks. Adam Taggart here. Chris Martinson and I are the co-founders of Peak Prosperity. If you want to get alerted whenever we release a new video from Chris, just click the red subscribe button right beneath the YouTube video player. Once you've done that, a little bell icon will appear right next to it. Click on that bell. It looks like this. And that's it. The next time we publish a video from Chris, you'll immediately receive a notification from YouTube. Thanks for watching our videos.